And bring this a little bit out of the way.
Right now. Yeah, all good here.
Great. I'm suffering from DOMS at the moment. I trained yesterday and the day before, and literally just before jumping on this call, I was training. Now I'm like, I can't straighten my arms. It's terrible. Hey, Yasser. Hey, Steve.
Pardon me. Hi, yes, sir.
How are things in Canada, Suki, with regards to kind of the COVID, and has it kind of sort of dipped down, and are things coming back to some sort of normality, or is it still a bit?
It's interesting. I live in a rural area just outside of Vancouver City. So as soon as the lockdown started happening here, we were very appreciative of the space that we had.
Yes.
People had to stay in their apartments. I heard it was a bit of, it was difficult for a lot of people around the world. Obviously, I've got friends still in the UK and London. I couldn't foresee myself or even bear the thought of being cooped up in a very small flat, unable to leave the front door. So for us over here, we feel a bit blessed, a bit privileged without sort of being too egotistical about it. Things did shut down. It did affect businesses. Not all of them are operating. Some restaurants did fold. But overall, we managed to stay healthy. We had green space to walk around in. Yeah. So it wasn't too bad. Yeah. I think we shut down 2 weeks prior to the UK. And in fact, when we shut down, I was surprised that the UK hadn't followed suit a bit quicker.
I think we're
not much about it, right? Yeah.
I think they're a bit slow in coming forward with most steps, really. But well, we'll see what happens. Hi, Phil. Hi, Steve. Hi, Muz. Stephen.
Hey, everyone.
Yeah. And all those others watching.
Give it a couple more minutes and then we'll kick off. Just wait for a few people to jump on. And for those that are on, thanks for joining. As we go through the talk, any questions, just put them in the chat box, and either myself or Alex will pick them up and we'll relay them to Suki.
Well, yes, it says whereabouts near Vancouver are you located?
Well, yes, it depends how close you are. I may not want you to know. I'm in Abbotsford, which is about an hour out.
Yes, it's in Dubai, I think.
All right. Oh, Yasser, right? I know Yasser. Hey, how you keeping on? Yeah.
Where are you? That's a question. Where are you? I'll answer.
There's a knock on the door.
Yeah, exactly. Which house?
Hey, you got nice curtains. Yeah, Phil Morrell says that he remembers Sifu Leung. Yeah, he said he lived in Tottenham.
That's exactly right. Yeah. What does Sifu Phil practice?
Sifu Phil is a Bagua practitioner, and he'll be on here. We're going to be speaking to him in a couple of weeks or so.
Is it 2 or 3 weeks?
We say, yeah.
We've said a date anyway. I think it's towards the end of September. I think we've got a date. Looking forward to that one as well.
Yeah, me too. That's fantastic.
Okay.
Yes, it says his daughter's in Vancouver, so he visits there.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Whenever that knock on the door.
Yeah. Send them to bring some samosas.
Yeah.
All right, let's kick it off. Yeah. Okay, everyone, welcome. Today we have Suki. He studied Wing Chun nearly 30 years now, and Chinese boxing under the late Leung Kwok Keung Sifu, and non-classical Gong Fu under the late Jesse Glover. He is also a no-gi jiu-jitsu practitioner, a keen advocate for pressure testing, athletic conditioning, and mindsetting. And Suki lives and teaches privately in British Columbia, Canada. Welcome, Suki. Thank you for taking the time out. to join myself and Alex to educate us and give us a little bit more information on Opera Company, or AKA Red Boat Wing Chun. Really happy to have you here.
Well, I appreciate you guys inviting me on. Yeah.
No, our pleasure. Our pleasure. Welcome, Suki, and everyone on Facebook. So let's just start off. Can you just tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into martial arts in the beginning, and your path to the Red Boat Wing Chun?
Sure. I'll try and keep it fairly brief. So I grew up in West London in the UK, not too far from Heathrow Airport, a place called Southall. I think, like a lot of people who grew up in the 70s and 80s, we were influenced by Bruce Lee. And I wanted to get that out there initially, just because I know that was the era of martial arts, and that was one of the reasons why they were attracted into that particular path. My first foray into martial arts was actually Shotokan karate. So it was in a Victorian school hall. This is going back to about 1984.
Yeah.
My dad, despite his issues with sobriety, one of the good things that came out of my relationship with him was that he was a Bruce Lee fan as well. And he felt that for his three boys, I have two siblings, one of whom is 7 years my senior, and he had already started karate, but me being quite sickly, scrawny and insecure, my dad thought, karate for you, son.
Yeah.
Now, the significance of that, ironically, is it left an imprint which put me off martial arts. I wanted nothing to do with them. Yeah. I ended up trudging to this old school Victorian school hall, watching people lined up in these white pajamas, and no overt disrespect to the karate practitioners out there. I have a huge amount of respect for all the traditional arts. It just wasn't for me. The conformity, the linear movements, the shouting, the kind of almost militaristic vibe that I felt there. And because I was just a skinny, scrawny kid, during kumite, during sparring, I got absolutely smashed. It wasn't a good look for an 8-year-old, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, as a result of that, I was like, this doesn't make sense. I have posters of Bruce on my bedroom wall. I look at the posters and I just couldn't see the congruence, because I didn't know he practiced these martial arts, and there was a stark difference between what I was being shown at this school. So for years, I just thought, this isn't for me. I'm going to go back to sketching in my little art books and try to live an introspective type life. So yeah, that was the first kind of foray, of the first attempt at martial arts.
And then you eventually start another martial art, or was your next step then like, right, found Wing Chun, that's what I'm doing?
My next step, interestingly, was avoid training at all costs. I had quite severe asthma growing up. I had a sibling who was born with Down syndrome. As I mentioned, my dad had issues with sobriety, so I lived a very insular life.
Yeah.
However, I got to a stage where I was able to go to university, where I was studying philosophy as an undergrad. And I think there's a flip side to people who come into martial arts or any kind of organized physical activity, and maybe even spiritual activities. Significant emotional trauma might lend a hand. And that was the turning point. So I was actually aged 18, and there was a nightclub incident in Leicester Square. I was out with a few friends. So obviously I'd grown a bit of a social network.
Sure.
I still wasn't particularly physical in any kind of way, shape, form, or fashion. But I remember quite vividly a group of us coming out of the nightclub, and about 10 or 15 feet away from us, we turned around to watch a melee happening in central London. Like, what was going on here? And we saw a guy getting the living crap beaten out of him, absolutely destroyed by a marauding group of about 5 younger guys. They were punching him. And I noticed how that made me feel. First of all, it was sort of the fear complex. Holy crap, this is happening right here.
In front of you as well, yeah.
Right in front, like 10, 15 feet away from us. The next thing I hear was a bottle smash, and one of the perpetrators crunched and ground this bottle into this poor guy's face. So you can imagine the types of sensations that caused, right? We were just absolutely flabbergasted. I remember my heart was racing. We were getting nervous. A police van happened to be parked just a bit further up the street. They waited until the group had finished their attack before they slowly meandered out of the van and came to the assistance of this poor guy that was left in a bloody heap on the floor. That was the changing point. So like I mentioned, significant emotional trauma can change a person. And, you know, a couple of weeks of sleepless nights, just replaying that event in my head. I spoke to my eldest brother, who's a black belt in karate at that point, and I just said, you know, I need to build up my confidence. I need to build up my awareness, because had I been in that position, I think I would have easily have been the victim, and it could have been me, right? Just like it can be anyone else, right?
Oh.
That's when the search began. So aged 18, I started looking, and I visited maybe 40, 60 different clubs around London, talked to different martial artists, tried to discern what type of martial art I would get into. And it always returned to this one kind of image. And that was, well, Bruce studied these martial arts. He was, as far as we could tell through our Western lens, a functional fighter. We didn't have the UFC. This predates all of those MMA type competitions. And as a result, Wing Chun came to the forefront. So it was like, you know, I looked at capoeira, I looked at some, you know, Punjabi kind of indigenous arts as well, like Hakka.
Hakka, yeah.
Yeah, even keeping an open mind with regards to Japanese arts, right? But Wing Chun was the one, and that's when the search began.
How did that go then? I mean, so I understand that Bruce was a huge inspiration for you.
Yeah.
And then you had already some knowledge about, okay, Bruce had done Wing Chun, JKD, and then you're like, okay, coming back to, okay, I now want to train martial arts.
Exactly right. So then it was just looking in the martial arts magazines for the closest club, the most local one. And there happened to be one not too far away from me in West London, which was a Waipo Tank, so an Ip Man lineage Wing Chun club. It was good enough for me. I enrolled hastily, started training, lapped it up, and found that I loved it. This was completely dissimilar to my previous experiences. There was less conformity. More time was spent engaged in sort of body-to-body contact methods, which is what I wanted. It was the closest thing that I could see in training, which would lend itself to street-type violence. You know, you were at close proximity. You know, you hear about Wing Chun, it's a close quarters combat style. That was the one for me, and I was satisfied. I was happy with that.
What was your first introduction to Wing Chun like? Was it what you imagined, or
I think it was. I think by that point I had carried out enough research to understand what the delineations were in different martial arts. So the first lesson, I would have been introduced to the first form, Siu Nim Tao. I would have started doing single sticking hands that you see a lot of people starting off with in the first couple of years before they introduced to the double-handed method of rotation. There were drills, and everything was conducted with regards to someone else. So he's feeding a punch and you're countering the punch, and you're working different type checking movements, grab and pulls. So it was fantastic. You know, I enjoyed it.
What year was this, Suki?
This was about 93. This is, you know, I mean, I use different reference points for my kind of history. I don't have the greatest sort of memory in the world, but I knew that Wu-Tang's album had come out, and that was so significant, especially if you're a Kung Fu head living now. That was significant to us, right?
I hear that. So when did you meet your Sifu, the late Lang Kwok Kong?
I was at home. I remember this. I was at home on a Saturday, and I received a phone call for someone asking for me, and they said, you'd left a message at this Wing Chun club, and finally we're getting back in touch with you. And I just thought, well, it's a bit late in the day. I'd already started training, and I was kind of happy with what I was receiving. And the guy insisted, and he said, you know what, you should come down and watch. No charge.
Oh, so you'd already reached out to different clubs and saying, hey, is it okay if I
Oh,
come
yeah.
down and train? So you'd
Oh,
already reached out to Sifu Learning School, but then
Yeah.
you'd gone to visit Waipo Tang's school, and then you'd like,
Yeah.
I start training there.
Which just happened to be local to me in West London.
Right.
This club, I had left a message because I knew they did Wing Chun. I didn't know that there was a differentiation between the kind of more mainstream types of Wing Chun and that ancestral styles or lineages of Wing Chun even existed. But in any event, I drove down to North London, to Angel Islington, parked my car. I said I'd go down. So I trudged down on the following Saturday, the following weekend. And I was looking around for this club called the Temple.
Temple School, yeah.
I couldn't find it. I went into this kind of newspaper shop. I was like, you know, there's supposed to be a school right here. This predates sort of navigation systems and iPhone. I couldn't see it. And I think there was a lady in the shop, and she said, well, if you go outside and look up, there's a poster. There was a huge poster of like a praying mantis or something on the street. I was like, how did I not see this, right? And there was a door, there was a buzzer. I got buzzed into the building. I remember going downstairs. Maybe you could fill in the gaps in knowledge, but I remember going downstairs into a basement level, a small desk to the left, this kind of middle-aged, slightly resentful, bitter, muscular-looking Chinese man sitting there with a wall of kung fu films behind him.
That's right. For those that probably aren't aware, Suki Sifu Learning was teaching Wing Chun at the Angel Islington Steel Wire Mantis School under Sifu Tony Leung. So you would come up to the top of Upper Street, where it kind of hit that monorail, just on that kind of that where it splits. And there was used to be a big Tesco Express there as well, I think, or That's right, next to it. So yeah, you would walk down, and you'd buzz in, and it'd be quite dark. You'd walk down these stairs, go through, and then as you walk through, there was a big double red doors, traditional red doors, and then there was kind of like a glass, kind of hazy kind of glass on the right hand side. Yeah. But it was quite an interesting experience to go down, right? So as soon as you go through, and then you were like, "Whoa, this is like an experience."
There's something to it. I mean, Joseph Campbell talks about in his hero's journey going through a threshold or passing a threshold. And you'll see these types of, this type of symbolism repeating itself in Chinese arts. And now, years later, I've come to the realization that those were significant events. So you're absolutely right, actually, just with that particular moment or that particular event, going through the double doors, there was someone there that was an entrance through the threshold. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the class is going to start in half an hour. Give me your £10 or £20, whatever it was. And I felt aggrieved because it was like, I'm just coming down to watch, but whatever, here we go. Yeah. You walked in and found yourself in this kind of underground layer with these pillars. To the left, as you walked in, there were a row of wooden dummies. There were sandbags that were hanging down.
Conditioning thing. And then the big Buddha in the front.
The big 12-foot Buddha in the corner with a kind of an altar in front of it. It was very much a surreal experience. Maybe it was by design supposed to be mystical. And I think, once again, referring back to our Western lens, we can write it off and just say it's superficial, right? But for me, it held significance then, and it continues to hold significance now.
Yeah.
So I waited around for the Wing Chun lesson. There was a group of people that started to filter in. I remember the guy leading the class taking me aside and spending time showing me some incredibly basic movements, kind of just lifting your arm, dropping it down, sort of a back fist here, bring your forearm over.
Sorry to interrupt, Suki. How long have you been training Wing Chun up until this point?
It would have been several months, maybe 6 months.
Okay.
Yeah, not too long. I was still learning the first form.
Days.
Gotcha.
Yeah, early days. Yeah, brand new days, right?
Gotcha. Right.
And I actually felt in that first lesson at this Angel Islington Steel Wire Mantis Club as if I'd taken a bit of a step back, because I'm like, well, he's just showing me to do stuff in it, just by myself. And all respect to the person that was leading me, he spent a good 45 minutes with me. So I felt, this is good, getting that amount of attention. Meanwhile, the students had kind of split into two groups, and they were doing either sort of exercise and stretching type stuff with one smaller portion of the group. Another portion of the group were doing sort of sticking hands, this kind of weird circular flowery type movement, as well as a form that I didn't recognize, a movement form. And I just thought, this is bewildering, but I like the experience. I was lapping it up, right? And in the background, you see this old Chinese guy sitting there with a fedora on, sort of yeah. And this is where the enigma of Sifu Lung starts to kick in. He wasn't interactive with the students. In fact, if anything, he was just there almost like a bystander, a bit removed from it all. He had his assistant, his number one, someone he'd obviously shown parts of the system to. He'd given him responsibility and authority to lead the class. Sifu had very little to do with the students. Every so often, he might sort of raise a finger. This guy would go scuttling up to him. Sifu would say something in his low kind of guttural voice, and the guy would go back and make a correction to maybe something he was doing, because he was still obviously new to it as well, but he was leading the class. Sifu was disassociated from students.
Right.
This may have something to do with traditionally the way that martial arts were taught with regards to him and how he felt martial arts should be taught. The students had to show themselves to be students or prove themselves to be students before he would even engage with them. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
It does. It does. I think that's a very strong, I think there's a very strong element of that for a lot of the traditional arts that the older generation, they're definitely, they're not going to invest time in you until you've shown character, until you've shown effort.
Absolutely.
So so I assume that happened, you did your first class, and what happened next? Did you then decide, okay, you know what, I'm going to jack in the other place, I'm going to start training here? Is that how it happened, or?
Kind of. It was a bit more nuanced than that. I was happy with the Ip Man type stuff I was doing in West London. I continued with that.
Okay.
Is if these guys ran a Saturday class, and this is a mindset that I continue to keep now, which is, if you've got something available to you, do it. If you've got the time, the spare time to do it, do it. Extra knowledge can't be bad for you. I don't believe in interference patterns being caused by other martial arts. I don't buy into that kind of myth. You should be absolutely and fundamentally loyal to just the primary art. So I continued with both.
Right.
I'm thinking maybe 6 months. It could be as long as a year in. I started to realize what I believe to be profound truths. And that is this system of Wing Chun, which looks completely dissimilar to everything that's presented to me via martial arts magazines and books. There may be something more to it. So I was intrigued from that angle. The way that I leveraged my learning as a segue to get into Sifu's good books was to invite myself along to participate in a private class. And I don't have any qualms about this. Sifu wasn't expecting me to turn up when he was teaching someone privately.
Yeah.
I just speak to that guy, Quincy, a friend of mine, and I said, hey, how about I kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, turn up when you're doing your own private class, which Sifu taught in a back garden on Anthill Road in Tottenham.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was actually teaching private classes throughout the week. And I just thought, you know what? Let's see what these private classes have to offer. So I walked through this gate. Quincy was already there. Sifu was there. And I remember the look of disdain when I turned up that first time because I was uninvited.
Yeah.
You're breaching a huge protocol.
Reasonable. What the hell are you doing here?
Exactly. So you're breaching a huge protocol in Chinese martial arts. And that is, if you're not invited, you shouldn't be here.
Yeah. Was that his house?
It was at his daughter's house in Tottenham, in Tottenham side.
Yeah, but like that's his place as well.
So that was his inner sanctum. That's where he taught privately. And that's where he taught privately only to students he thought he had potential. Now, I did not fit into that category at all. Not even slightly. I was all over the place.
What?
Yeah. I didn't have any type of coordination.
So,
I
so
was
like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Can I come to your private? And he's like, yeah. Of course you can.
And the only thing that I managed to create was a hostile environment. Yeah, but I stuck with it. It was like, well, I'll see what Quincy does. I'll stand here. Surely the old man isn't going to just keep me here, sort of, just doing nothing.
Yeah.
And with a bit of resentment, the old man had me going through some movements. And as soon as I heard Quincy make mention of another private session in the organization, I was like, yep, I'll be back. So I just kept going.
You were paying as well, were you? Or you just turning up?
Oh, no. You pay. If the thing is worthwhile, you pay. And I've always been of the mindset, which is when you have access to this type of ancient knowledge, fair dues, you give what you receive, right? So you pay.
Yeah, definitely. There's nothing free.
Nothing, yeah. And in fact,
very rare.
Yeah. And in fact, when I started working years later, I bumped up the amounts that I was contributing to Sifu. I was just like, hey, and you do what you have to do. I mean, once you understand sort of the cultural implications, I'm bringing alcohol bottles, and I'm teetotal. I've always been teetotal, but it was sort of, these are the types of things that you do for your mentor, for your teacher, right? Once you get accepted as sort of, an inner door disciple, let's say, right? There was a bit of cunning involved as well. I knew that at some point Quincy would have to cancel one of his sessions. The human condition is one where no matter what you do, there's always going to be other things that you have to attend to. Maybe you're sick on a particular day. So I knew at some point he would have to cancel a lesson, and I would turn up there by myself. How would Sifu handle it then? Would he have me kind of... Yeah.
So you ingratiated yourself.
I did, in a very roundabout way, but let me be absolutely straight with this. Even up to about 4 years into the training, Sifu was still kind of aloof with his students. Yeah. So this isn't the type of place where, and this isn't the type of martial art, Chinese martial arts especially aren't the type of martial arts where you expect to come away with some gifts of knowledge and you can punch and kick and, be sort of a handy superhero type martial artist after 6 months. That's not the way that it works, especially with these old guard, these old Sifu. And you have to understand he was already in his late 60s.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. They will protect what they see as their inheritance knowledge that's passed on to them. They hold it in very seriously, very in high regard.
Yeah.
And they look at you as a student in the long term, in the whole thing. So from the West, we want quick results. We want to see, we paid £10 today. What did I get for that today? Next week, what am I going to get? But they just look at it in the long term. So there's plenty of time for you to show character and determination, and
I think that's exactly
willingness and hard work, and that's what they're.
It is that
you need to convince them, and it takes years.
As you said, he as one of these old guard coming up, and as you said, being 60 years old, you've got to prove yourself, right? Prove yourself that he can pass on the system to you, and there's a lot of things that come into that with regards to your character and everything else. So. With that, can you tell us a little bit about your Sifu? A little bit about his history, if you know, and
yeah, absolutely. I just want to sort of clarify a couple of things with regard to the symbolism. So, Sifus are looking at a couple of things. When they accept you as a student, if you're a fan of wuxia novels, you realize that you become part of Jianghu. Now, this is a very ambiguous term. They're talking about the people of lakes and rivers, but what it means is a type of brotherhood. That's right. That you create when you're training martial arts. And one of the things, going back to Alex's point, is they're looking for Wu Dei, they're looking for martial virtue.
Yeah.
Are you a good person?
Yeah.
How do you live your life? And if you're a good person, then I'll accept you in. And there's further symbolism that will lend itself to creating that relationship. You know, by sea ceremony, when you offer a cup of tea to your Sifu, he's not, Sifu in itself as an expression, I mean, there's a dual meaning to it. It's definitely a teacher and a mentor, kind of a life coach, but it's also a father figure.
Mm-hmm.
The person is adopting you as a son. And that, it took a few years before I was able to even get over that obstacle.
Right.
Sorry, Nish, to interject. I think
no, that was, of course, that's an important point. Just out of interest, by that time, so before we got onto your Sifu, so were you still doing both the different Wing Chun classes, or had you then started to coming more towards the private classes, then doing more at the
I dropped off from the Ip Man Club. I was under the belief that there was something more to the knowledge that this old man had, right? I mean, I don't know whether it's authenticity, but just the bits of information that were available to me. And I'll give you one prime example that also points to the way that Sifu taught. Tony Leung had he was on a bit of a campaign to ingratiate himself with other martial arts teachers. He wanted to provide room and scope at the temple Steelwire Mantis school for other martial art instructors to come in to teach traditional martial arts. So he was writing in combat.
Right.
He submitted an article about Sifu and the differences between his ancestral Wing Chun and other forms of Wing Chun. And interestingly, one of the questions that Sifu Tony Leung had for Sifu Leung was, well, this mysterious third hand form, BOD, this piercing or darting fingers, give me more information about it. And up until that point, Sifu had been quite amenable and sort of had done demonstrations with regards to the other forms. But when it came to that particular form, he said, no, I don't show that. So even within those inner circles where you have people that know arts and they're deep within Chinese martial arts, the old guard still preserved their knowledge. They still put up a huge obstacle. So that is another example of it. He wasn't doing it simply with Western students. He was doing it with people who were already converts of the traditions. Yeah.
Right.
And this was a theme that was to continue with my experiences. So going back to what Sifu, he was born in 1927 in Guangdong, China. He had a vast wealth of knowledge when it came to Chinese martial arts. He'd practiced Chinese martial arts from the age of 8 when he was sent as an apprentice into one of the opera houses that was operating in Guangzhou,
right.
Up until retirement, which happened in his late 60s. So you have almost 60 years of knowledge.
Wow.
Absolutely particular knowledge, because his vocation wasn't going out to work. It wasn't office related. His vocation was martial arts. When you're part of the opera clan, 30% of your time is basically spent doing painted faces, kind of costume drama type training, and 70% of your time is spent doing martial arts. So his vocation was martial arts. It was part of his genetic makeup, let's say.
Yeah.
And just realizing that, you understand that these types of people were at that point incredibly rare, and they grow even rarer now.
Yeah, yeah. And it also, when you see someone's grown up through that, you begin to understand why they put such a value on it and why it's not shared just willy-nilly.
Yeah, exactly.
It has a value for their cultural identity, and that brotherhood, as you say, you know. It's not everyone's cup of tea, and I hear a lot of people in the West say, I don't need all that cultural stuff. I just want to learn how to fight, and that's fine for them, you know. But there is the truth is there are still people of the old tradition, and you know, we're still lucky that there's people that old tradition, you know.
Yeah, I believe myself to be a bit of a paradox, because here I am trying to preserve this teaching and upholding this tradition, but I'm also seeing it through a Western lens. And I personally am opposed to sort of the exotification of Chinese martial arts, where sort of you put the culture before the martial art and you use the culture to kind of define yourself as a person. I'm not doing that. I grew up in the West. I grew up in West London. I live in Vancouver, Canada. those experiences are part of my martial art training and philosophy. And I think that's what you do. When you're given a gift, use it, but use it your way. Don't hold to the kind of shackles of history. However, always hold a respectful nod to those that went before you, right?
Yeah.
Understand that.
Yeah.
So going back to his training, Sifu had a plethora of styles that he knew. He had trained, and I've got a bit of a list in front of me. He'd trained Steel Wayan Nun with Lian Xiaoyin. He trained Hungar with Ge Erfeng. He trained Lohan style with Lu Lingyun. He demonstrated to me in the garden, and he was showing different people different hands. But I know that he knew Choi Lei Foot, Bagua, Tai Chi, which I also sort of dipped into with him, Hop Ga. But his fighting style, and he always put this first and foremost, his fighting style was Wing Chun. And it was the Wing Chun that I was most interested in. So for people to understand this, and I had a bit of a tough time, it's like, how can someone claim to know, several types of different Chinese martial arts when it takes a lifetime basically to master one? Well, looking into different principled approaches to learning, what you'll realize from writers like Robert Greene, who wrote a fantastic book on mastery, was in about 10 years, you're going to have something special. So when you average this out and you say that a person spent 60 years in these Chinese traditions, it's not unreasonable to appreciate that they probably had a few systems under their belt.
Yeah.
I think a foundation in one or two of the styles will also speeds up your approach in the other styles as well. Yeah. You've already got some fundamental understanding.
Absolutely. When you learn something, when you learn a system in martial arts, you also learn how to learn. You become an efficient learner. So when it comes to the second or third style, and I think both of you can probably speak to this. I know that Nish has experience with jiu-jitsu. Perhaps for myself, as soon as I looked into learning jiu-jitsu, I was able to sort of use those skills that I'd used to deconstruct and unpack Chinese martial arts and apply them to learn a bit more efficiently, let's say. Yeah.
I think once you're used to seeing movements, patterns, applications, and that's the way you're, like you said, that's how you start to think.
Yeah.
And concepts and everything else that comes into learning a martial art. Yeah. When you start to look at other arts, you see it from that lens. So like you said, with jiu-jitsu, I was like, oh, that reminds me of this. It's very similar to this move. It's very similar to that move. Same with whether it's Muay Thai or boxing, there are certain movements you're like, yeah, I can get that. I understand it. Or I've got the kind of the muscle memory, or I've been in this sort of position before, so, and that's really helpful.
I think if we started to get deeper into that topic alone, if you're a slow learner, there's a certain virtue to it. It can become useful in the long term, because if you've had to really work hard at deconstructing something and applying it to self, later on, you have to invest time into it, but later on, everything becomes a tool for learning. You can observationally learn every time you look at MMA on television or clips on YouTube. You can observationally learn when people are demonstrating a technique to you. So, and there's plenty of research that supports that. I mean, Anders Ericsson talked about sort of deliberate learning and how you apply that to learning something deeply and profoundly. Robert Greene's book on mastery, Josh Waitskin's book, and he's a guy that moved from Tai Chi to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He wrote a book called The Art of Learning, which is absolutely superb. And you see the similarities and the themes that kind of permeate all of these things. Once you've learned how to learn something deeply, everything else becomes more efficient later on in life.
Right. So like Sifu Leng had a lot of arts under his belt, with 60 years of that was his vocation. He was a martial artist in that respect. And then, as you were saying, his preference was towards Wing Chun. So where does his Wing Chun Kung Fu come from?
I've had to try to piece together certain parts of history. And which is great because it inspires me to keep kind of chipping away at this marble block in order to try and unlock the information that's held deeply. So I've managed to talk to a couple of people that were related to Sifu, obviously family members. I've reached out to them. He has a son in Hong Kong, but some of his past, just like he was a bit guarded about the way he taught martial arts, some of his past is guarded. And it's hard to take it out of the context of Chinese history, especially around Guangzhou. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can try and get into this a bit deeply. We can talk about sort of Chinese tradition and especially the role of the Chinese opera as sort of being this hub of activity where they're going from town to town, traveling on the Yellow River, so traveling by these red boats and performing in front of these small towns and villages, but also the types of people that those opera troupes attracted. So you had people who were accused of sedition or kind of running away from the Qing dynasty, or anyone who is conducting some type of rebellious kind of form of life, trying to overthrow the Qing government, trying to fight against Western oppression. You have this theme of rebellious activity. The opera houses attracted this. This was the kind of the focal point for these types of activities.
Good place to disappear. You know, under the radar.
Yeah. So opera traveling performers and the people associated with opera boats were the lowest classes. They were sort of on the same kind of rung as people who were involved in gambling, sort of the lowest classes. And they took solace and comfort being with this brotherhood, the people around you, and training and performing. We've got red junk opera houses running for hundreds of years, but the real heyday seems to be from the fall of the Qing dynasty, which is about 1910, 1911 to about the late 1930s. And we have some gaps of information. I mean, what happened to the red junks? Why aren't we able to see examples of them now?
Yes.
And then once you start sort of going a bit deeper into history, and I'm not a historian, but I'm trying my best, right? You'll find that when the Japanese occupation took place in the port town of Guangzhou, a lot of the boats were destroyed in around 1938 by the Japanese. They were kind of bombed. So there are no real examples of those red junks, but we have some information. It tells us how many people were traveling on the boats, how big they were, how opera people conducted their business, the types of martial arts that they trained. So I've had to piece this together and I'm sort of getting a bit of a clearer picture.
Right.
Sifu would have trained with a bunch of different instructors. As far as I can tell, he had two people that would have influenced him in the fighting arts. One in particular, a chap by the name of Liang Fu Dao. So we're looking at probably post 1940s.
Right.
Liang Fu Dao, as I understand it, had taken refuge within the confines of the opera. He had links to the imperial palace. And when the young emperor Pu Yi had abdicated the court in 1911 and nationalist movements had kicked in China, anyone who had associated themselves with the dynasty was facing persecution.
Yeah.
And one of Sifu's main instructors was one of these chaps who was sort of hiding from the law, hiding from officials.
Yeah.
Okay? You have an amazing shift that takes place during this era from the fall of the dynasties to nationalism, and then the slow kind of movement into communist China, which is where we stand. Now, these movements did a number of things that are fundamental to Chinese martial arts as we understand them. First and foremost, where are they? What are the traditional martial arts? Why do they not exist in an accessible form? Now, where's the knowledge? Where are the books? Where are the manuals?
Yeah.
And what we find is they were associated with feudalistic and old and traditional belief systems. And you had this principled approach to destroying everything to do with this old knowledge.
Yeah.
There was this theory of the four evils in China, old traditions, old beliefs. And if you could destroy them and eradicate them and remove them from Chinese history, it would lend itself to a more progressive future.
Yeah.
So these martial artists had a couple of options. They were either going to take cover and hide, or they were going to flee.
Yeah.
To Hong Kong, Macau, Malaysia.
That's right.
And this is where you have these splintered traditions in Wing Chun. A lot of these old Sifus left, and you see their lineages continuing to exist, but in very isolated forms. And why are they isolated? Why are the ancestral forms of Wing Chun isolated from the more mainstream Wing Chun that we get, which is basically fed to us from Ip Man and Bruce Lee? These guys continue to teach in a traditional way. They take on maybe one or two disciples. The art is therefore preserved, but it doesn't reach the mainstream because, you know, there are barriers to it. If people are drawn to things like Wing Chun, they're going to go to the one that's more closely associated to people like Bruce Lee.
Yeah, the popularity of the Ip Man lineage just exploded because of Bruce Lee. So it's understandable that even with these smaller ancestral styles, you know, that they just don't have the popularity and to retain their qualities.
Yeah,
they can't be taught and commercialized in the same way that the Ip Man.
Yeah, and that popularity continues with all the movies that are dedicated to Wing Chun with regards to Ip Man 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
The Grandmaster, blah blah blah. They're all Ip Man Wing Chun, which isn't a bad thing, but it just means that
because he's the most popular in the West, he's seen in the West as the most
exactly,
because of, you know, exploded because of the Bruce Lee phenomenon.
Now, which is a discussion in and of itself. What about Pao Fa Lien, Ji Xian Wing Chun? What about Yuan Kei San Wing Chun or Sam Nung Wing Chun? There are other types of ancestral Malaysian Wing Chun. They have their own systems. Vietnamese Wing Chun. We have the Gu Lao village Wing Chun. We have these isolated ancestral forms that continue to exist. And without people showing interest, what will happen? And it doesn't take multi-generations for these arts to be lost. It takes one generation. That's all it is. Yeah.
Well, all we can hope is that the people that have found Wing Chun via the plethora of Ip Man styles or whatever, you know, if they're real searchers, and you know, people are all different. Some people will be happy with what they've got. Others will search, and others will like the flavor of something different, like the red rose, like gulao, like pinsan or whatever. All these different styles. I've heard of quite a few of them, but not really, no real knowledge of any of them because, you know, they're very few and far between. You know.
Yeah. Well,
are there fundamental differences between these ancestral styles of Wing Chun, or
one question we have, and it's time to now, you know, I've been saving the questions. People on Facebook, I will be asking them. I'll ask the last one first because it's pertinent now. It says, can you tell a little bit about the difference between since you've studied the Ip Man Wing Chun and your red boat?
Yeah.
Is there any particular thing that you would that it's different?
There's a couple of ways that we can start sort of unpacking this. Now, I like to look at different mystical approaches and different theories as they exist pertaining to things like religion and other philosophical movements. I studied philosophy. Now, Fritjof Schuon was a German mystic, and he talked about religion, but he talked about the perennial truth, those signature things that permeate all religions. Now, when you look at the different ancestral Wing Chun types, exactly the same thing can be said. There's a perennial truth to them all. They have signature movements to the discerning eye that you'll be able to recognize.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They all share similarities.
Yeah, he's talking about like the essence.
The essence.
That essence will be carried through all of those, and that's what makes them what they are.
Exactly.
But the flavor, as it develops, they'll slant in a different direction, maybe.
Absolutely. So when we go back to the red boats and we talk about historic figures like Wang Wabo, Leung Yi Tai, you've all seen Prodigal Son, Tang Sao.
Brilliant. Favorite film.
When you look at these historical figures, you'll understand that at some point, Leung Jan was taught, and then which gave rise to Wing Chun as it existed on land. and a systematic approach in places like Hong Kong. However, the Red Boat never lost their tradition. The Red Boats never really lost their Wing Chun tradition. It continued to develop, or alternatively or inversely, the Wing Chun that they had was preserved. So it has, like I say, it shares signatures with every other form of Wing Chun, but it's distinct. Now, there are a few ways to differentiate what I do from more mainstream approaches to Wing Chun. So when we look at it analytically and start looking at the forms, our forms almost double in length. So we still have the same forms. You're learning Siu Nim Tao, Chum Kyu, Biu Zi. We've got the Muk Yan Zhong, the wooden dummy. We have the sword form and the pole form. Both weapon forms in my system have a very strong Hung Gar type flavor. So when I carried out cross-examinations of Hung Gar weapon forms compared to the more linear Wing Chun forms, especially when you look at their pole, and I believe they only have a very short sequence in their pole, you'll realize that, hey, things aren't making sense here. Why has something been reduced down to these straight linear kind of progressions in their weapons? Whereas even if you look at the shape of the butterfly forms, I mean, reasonably speaking, I'd say that they were designed for kind of more slashing circular movements rather than those straight line stabbing motions. So our forms are, I'm told that they were all 108 moves each.
Wow.
Whereas the Ip Man, if we take the first form, Siu Nim Tao, in the Ip Man version, you have 6 sections. In our form, you have 10 sections. There's a huge burden shift onto the student, which kind of talks to why it took me 11 years to even finish the form, finish the system with my Sifu, is because there's a lot to it. You still have the elbow to elbow, body to body methods. The training was structured slightly differently. So in a typical Wing Chun class, you might do form practice followed by Chi Sao practice. Ours was structured in a way where you did 8 almost like a warm-up, form sequences used to kind of move the body round. It was used to remind yourself of different whipping type motions with the body, stretching motions, wide horse stances to stretch out. You would then, in a session, move on to form work. And I trained most of my time with Sifu one-on-one. So it got to a point where it was just me and him, and he couldn't speak English. So that's another thing that is worth mentioning, is he spoke Cantonese. And probably much like yourselves, our Cantonese instruction at school in London wasn't particularly good, let's say.
It wasn't.
It was a bit limited.
Yeah.
But after a few years of training with him, I kind of got the essence of what he was trying to show in each movement.
Same with me and my Sifu, yeah.
Yeah, it got to a point where you understood. You understood on a more fundamental level than words can ever even express, right? So Bodhidharma, in one of his, I think it's the outline of practice, he's talking about Buddhism as being beyond words and scriptures. And I think it got to the point where learning was like that. I'm not saying it was supernatural. I'm just saying you understand the nuances of body language. You can communicate in other ways, and in arguably a more pure fashion, because it's based on what? Martial arts are about combat. They're about movement. If you're communicating with just movement, you're not weighing it down with the baggage of some of the expressions and labels that are used, which can sometimes confuse the mind. So if I talk to you and I say, Tan Sao is referred here, Tan Sao is referred to the beggar's hand block. That in and of itself is meaningless. But then if you look at another type of action way of defining it, it's known as the dispersing hand. And for the West, this can be a bit tricky, where every hand gesture has this kind of aesthetic meaning as well as a functional meaning, right?
Right.
So anyway, we would do the warm-up, this 8-sequence warm-up to begin with, which was kind of akin to Shaolin-esque exercises. Then we'd move on to form work. And the majority of my classes would consist of form work. So I'm going through the forms and then learning new sequences as I progressed year to year.
Sure.
And what he would do for the body to body, the Chi Sao part of training, is he'd have overlapping sessions. So if there was another private student that was training, he'd have that person turn up maybe during the last 45 minutes of my own training session, and then we'd get to test out, to play. My Sifu described it as one chisa, which means to play sticking hands. So so that was kind of how I learned. So in order to differentiate it, the forms are a lot longer. I would argue that they're a bit more intricate. They're a bit more difficult to comprehend. Some of the stuff might, to the uninitiated, seem a bit flowery as well. It's like these circular movements. Red Belt Wing Chun never gave up some of its circular movements. I understand about efficiency and sort of the mechanics of going in a straight line, but there were times, and it's reflected in our forms, and the forms are the seeds of knowledge. Where sometimes circular punches coming around the side, the gua choi, these types of movements are going to be useful as tools, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think even say, like, you know, with the kind of, we talked about the Ip Man lineage and it maybe being a bit more linear, but for those that get deep into that system, will understand and develop their knowledge to deal with what, you know, through their system, that method of dealing with any eventuality. It grows and it you know, your knowledge grows beyond the simple basic movement that you've shown, that you realize you can do that movement and move as well. So, you know, you're not limited to that linear thing. So, you know, they'll find, just don't want to get the Ip Man people upset and think that we're just limiting their kind of system, as it were.
Not at all.
It's not about discrediting or taking away anything. If someone enjoys what they do, then more power to them. Let them enjoy it, right? I think our approach is slightly different because we've gone a bit deeper into ancestral approaches. Just to stay on this topic without deviating too far, we still retained in this Red Boat Wing Chun the Tao Tao Fo Chum, the sort of the sinking, the floating dynamics, or the internal energetic
dynamics.
Now, there seems to be a bit of a resurgence within Wing Chun circles to start reinventing the wheel, in that they're looking at these ancient doctrinal principles and trying to reabsorb and assimilate it. And yet, you know, 30 years ago, 27 years ago, when I tried to talk about this and raise it as a subject with other Wing Chun folk, let's say that they weren't particularly accommodating. In fact, if anything, I wasn't welcomed into those more mainstream discussions, because it was like, well, you do something that's so alien to us that it can't be correct. It must be false.
Is it just briefly, is there an emphasis on the elbow power?
Yeah, the sinking elbow. I mean, it depends what you mean. If you're talking about sort of Dai Jan Lick. Heavy elbow. Do you, is that a principle within your system? Absolutely. And it's not a principle of a system. I think it's a fundamental principle of good biomechanics.
It is, but I see, I won't name, but I see other systems where I think personally that it's missing. And so I just think that that it's been hidden. The structural integrity of that system, for me, means it has to be in there, and it actually makes such sense that the system is based and derived on developing short power that way. But a lot of people that I've spoken to don't know about it. We're
not here to offend people.
No.
What we're trying to suggest is it may not be missing. Like I said, it only takes one generation for knowledge to be lost. Now, what inadvertently happens is, depending on your own sort of idiosyncrasies, things become de-emphasized, which means it may be existent. If you look at the forms and the seeds of the forms, you might be able to see it, even though the person demonstrating the form may not be in a position to understand, explain, or emphasize. So it's there.
I mean, we've spoken about this before, Suki, because having seen some of your training, some of your forms, I even commented that has a Hakka flavor to it.
Absolutely.
Like having, I mean, if we get a chance, we'll share your your Instagram with the group where you can see some of the training that Suki does. And I was looking at some of his training. I messaged him. I said, Suki, you've got a real Hakka flavor to your red boat Wing Chun. Tell me more. And that's when you start to explain. Okay, well, we use the heavy elbow. We have the float, spit, swallow, sink. And this is the flavor that we have to it. And that was very interesting to me because I hadn't seen. It brought back some memories of watching some of the classes back in the day. But then I was like, yeah, I can. This is interesting.
Yeah, Hakka. You're looking at, I mean, snake spine crane arms. So we're looking at huge influences of Wing Chun generally. You're looking at Fukian white crane, a real old traditional system that spans back thousands of years, which also seem to maintain this Shaolin-esque myth of this Buddhist nun that witnessed the fight between the snake and crane. You see this kind of symbolism arise in different martial arts systems. But for me, if you're applying the hung type forms to our weapons, you're looking at Hakka arts like snake and dragon. And my Sifu was a practitioner of Lung Ying. So he knew the Hakka system of Lung Ying. Yeah. And I think that was enmeshed in our Wing Chun. So if I have that type of discussion, I'm going to be the first one to say of course there's a Hakka flavor because we do dragon. Sure, snake is part of Wing Chun mainstream knowledge, but the dragon as a mythological entity and its relevance to opera training when they traveled around in dragon boats and used dragon poles, you start to see slightly wider perspective. So we've got crane, we've got dragon, and even the crane in mythological terms, every time you throw the Gao Choi or the Fang An Choi, the phoenix eye, you realize, well, is this actually that symbolically speaking a crane, or does it speak to something mythologically higher in terms of consciousness, the phoenix, the dragon, right? These types of things. These are all questions that I have. I believe I'm getting somewhere with it. I'm uncovering mysteries, but I enjoy these bits of knowledge that are missing.
Yeah.
It's rewarding because it allows me to not just practice physically. So I've moved beyond just physical. My training's always there. My lifestyle is structured in such a way where if someone were to ask me, well, what type of training do I do? It's like, you don't understand the way I live. My respite from training is going to work. Most people go to work and they're looking at setting aside a couple of hours to train. That's not the way that I've managed to structure my life. Kung Fu martial arts is something I do constantly, I'd argue. And then my respite from that is spending time with the family and going out to work. That's my downtime. That's my relaxed. There's a lot of information to unpack. Yeah. There are different ways that we can proceed.
There's another one for you. Another question. In Southern Mantis, for example, our first one, Samba Chin, it's a seed form. It's also the master form, the form that never ends. It's the whole system is in there. There's many answers in there.
Yeah.
Is that similar for the Silam Tao in your Wing Chun? I spread across evenly.
Yeah, I've met hundreds of martial artists, hundreds of Kung Fu practitioners. One friend of mine only does Silam Tao form. And when I touch hands with this guy, he's just breathtaking. His structural integrity when he's engaging in Chi Sao, and it's different. He doesn't have this attack-based system. He has a control-based system. So he's not looking at trying to hit you with Park Sao, Lap Sao. He's not even functioning on that level. He's moved beyond it. And what he's doing is, if there's any initiation to attack, he's stopping it at that very point. So it's more structurally based. Silam Tao is the seed.
Yeah.
In fact, arguably, with good Silam Tao practice, you can still be a handy, tasty Wing Chun man without ever moving into the other forms. That's how profound it is. That's how important it is. It's very much the seed form.
There you go, Moz. Hope that answers that one. There was another one here.
Here's another question. How do you adapt the Wing Chun traditional stances to modern fighting applications?
I'm going to answer this in a slightly different way. So I had two mentors. Sifu Lung was my first mentor. And for me, it was an amazing experience, almost quasi-mystical experience meeting him. And then when he died in 2004, I got in touch with Jesse Glover in Seattle, who was Bruce Lee's first student. He was also his assistant instructor. So he was a guy who spent an enormous amount of time with Bruce Lee when Bruce Lee had just moved to Seattle. Jesse was once asked about stance work. I saw a student ask him and say, well, how do you fire? How do you throw a punch? Do you stand like this? And Jesse just looked at him and didn't say anything. And the guy said, well, what is the stance that you initiate your attack from? And Jesse just said, well, how are you standing? I'm doing a very poor impression of Jesse. Well, how are you standing? He was trying to point out to the guy is for his system, non-classical Kung Fu based on his learning with Bruce Lee, there was no such thing as stances. It was just you deal with it and you cope with it and you operate from it no matter how you find yourself, whether you're on your feet or whether you're on your back or anything else. You use good structural biomechanics, which are internalized based on the training methods. However, coming back in order just to give this person a bit more information to work from, how do you adapt the Wing Chun movements to sparring?
Traditional stances to the modern fighting application. So
you're training good habits, and then you practice those habits by allowing the fight and the type of sparring or the type of fighting that you're doing to dictate what comes out. So if you've practiced your forms hard enough, you're going to use your experiences that you gain from things like sparring to adapt your methods. And this is where the individual approach starts to trump what you may have been taught traditionally. I know how I use my stances. I know how I'll move around on mats if I'm doing some type of MMA-based sparring. I know how I do it, but to suggest that another person is going to do it in a similar or the same way is unfair of me, because it's almost like planting my biases on them. There are ways to adapt it. The Sil Nim Tao, the Yiji Kim Yong Ma for one, the major training platform or stance, the kind of adduction stance where you're clamping your knees in. First of all, in Red Belt Wing Chun, the stance is slightly different. It's more upright. You don't butt in your knees because you're not looking to struggle with
mobility.
With the integrity of the structure. You don't buckle your knees in, right? There's an external rotation that happens at the knees and the hip and the ankles, and it relates to the way that you hold your spine, your shoulders, your elbows. All of this stuff works in its totality. But when you start making that stance mobile, and Sifu spent a hell of a lot of time working mobility type movements. When you start to make the stance mobile, you realize there are ways to move this, especially when you're using those kind of energetics, the Tao Tao Fo Chum, that especially you realize when to be mobile and when to root down.
It has to be natural. It has to be natural. I think people make the mistake with traditional arts. I think, for me, the traditional arts, all the traditional methods are to teach you a method, to teach you the essence, which you have to internalize and use naturally. You don't do it robotically, and that's, I think, where a lot of people make a mistake about what the traditional arts are and how to fight. If you're going to just adopt traditional poses and stances, you're going to get killed very quickly.
If, in fact, adopting those traditional stances pre-fight is dangerous, because you're saying to him, well, now you know how to attack me, right? I'm giving you the clues on how to attack me. Now, if I can quote Korzybski, who said, the map is not the territory, Alex, you're spot on. The ancestral arts or the fighting arts are a map, but you have to apply it on an individual level. But how do you do that? How do you move from training these traditional forms and applying it to a setting which enables you to use it, for example, for sport? It's easy to answer that. Practice.
Yeah,
practice.
that's it. That's what I was going to say. It's experience and knowledge,
Yeah.
and time.
Yeah. If you've trained traditional arts to the point where they're subconscious, so they're not being filtered through logical interpretation of what's happening in real time. Once they're subconscious, you have those habits already ingrained, but then you need to go into that sparring context and spend time there. And it will tell you what not to do first and foremost, but it will also reveal to you the gems which will tell you what to do given those circumstances.
Yeah.
And adaptation is such an integral, important part of being a well-rounded martial artist. It's what Bruce Lee was preoccupied with, right? Adaptation.
Yeah.
We've had a question that just come in and said, when you say touch hands, how are you sparring to reflect real situations? What type of practice are you doing to use the form in a practical MMA or fighting situation?
Yeah.
Most people forget all Wing Chun, or not in this context, training in a real fight.
Yeah. Now, I'm the biggest proponent of traditional Chinese martial arts, but at the same time, I'll be the first to discredit it, to criticize it, and to try and point out its deficiencies, especially when you're using a Western approach. When it comes to sparring, we have to try and define what the expression is. When we look at fighting, it's like, okay, what is the domain? What is the territory? What is the terrain? Who are we fighting against? How many people? What is the application? Everything has to be, like I said, subject to adaptation. I know what I do. I can give you a brief overview of how I've trained my methods, and that is I'm a traditional Kung Fu man who's taken his traditional Kung Fu, and I've been absolutely smashed, whooped, destroyed, humiliated, but I've always scraped myself up to get back onto those mats. So I've tested it in a couple of domains. I train and cross-train other arts, and I always have done. And that's the quickest, surest method to tell you what will work and when and what doesn't work. And for me, from personal experience, from what I do, there has been more that hasn't worked than has worked. But I've had to learn other methods in order to become well-rounded. And what I want to do is talk about these things separately. There's
Sure.
the traditional martial arts part of it, and that's subject to what we're talking about today. We're focused on that. But then there's also the individual enterprise, which is, well, what are your experiences? What are you trying to do? And what have you done? And what I've done is I've mixed with, and I continue to mix with wrestlers, because I was threatened by what wrestlers would present in terms of dilemmas. I cross-train with grapplers, I cross-train with strikers. Right now, day-to-day basis, I'm spending a bit more time on the mats, just trying to hone my skills as a grappler. But I also find it quite addictive, right? Sort of learning other ways to move the body. And it's just, it's almost like, for me, it's the physical arcade game. I just enjoy it. I enjoy that stuff. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Before we kind of, because I do want to go into your training and your route with Jesse Glover. Are there any stories or lessons that kind of jump out for you with your training with your Sifu in Wing Chun? Any kind of, like, this was a big lesson for me, or maybe a funny story or something that, you know?
Loads. I mean, you have to understand that I spent the good part of 11 years with this guy, training with this angry old man, right? And sort of in a garden, in a back garden in West London, which was so alien an idea. You have to understand that he came from Guangzhou and just happened to find himself in North London, and I just happened to find myself in that same garden as him, sharing the same space as him.
Why was he in London though? What was the move to, was it family, or?
He'd stopped training martial arts and coaching martial arts as part of the opera. He had worked as an assistant director. And for him, he was moving in, I mean, he was in his late 60s, he was moving into more of a retirement phase. And for him, retirement meant being closer to family. And he had daughters that were in London with their sort of children. And ultimately, he moved here, as I understand it, for those compelling reasons.
Right.
Maybe more to this story. there's a bit of an idea that he was associated with the Lunyi Tongs. So, what was the significance of brotherhoods? And, I was told that he had worked as a bodyguard. When you talk about escorting services that started to arise in China in the 20th century, you're talking about huge amounts of banditry, especially in villages. And when you're traveling from place to place, you would quite often hire these bodyguards in order to protect whatever you're carrying. And Sifu was part of that. Like I said, there's an idea that he was associated with a family lineage of Tongs, which means he would have been subject to things like blood oaths, sworn brotherhoods, maybe secret societies, without getting too conspiratorial about it all. So this is part of his story as well. But there are loads of stories. For me, I'm thankful for the experience of having shared the same space as this incredible old man.
Yeah.
And it's just, I was there, 2-3 times a week for, 2 hours on average each time. And then because of the way that I live and my obsessive nature when it comes to things that I'm interested in, I'd go away, constantly thinking about those lessons, writing them down and practicing day to day. So it shaped and changed the way that I live my life. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So loads. I mean, the way that he did his pole, his weapons, all of this stuff.
When did you think to yourself, oh, he's kind of accepted me, or like, what?
Yeah.
Was there a moment, or was there
a couple of things happened. About 4 years in, I realized that he was more amenable to my presence, which doesn't mean he was smiling when I turned up. He always had this kind of constant scowl.
Less angry.
He was, maybe sort of a slightly less tempered approach. Yeah. But our kind of conversations translated via his daughter, my experiences in the garden training with him one-on-one, led me to believe that he'd kind of warmed to me slightly after about 4 years, when he didn't have me doing very basic type movements and very basic type stance work. So it took a lot of time before he moved into the higher levels or layers of Wing Chun. And then there was one particular incident where we were, I believe it was the Canton restaurant just off Leicester Square in London, during Chinese New Year celebrations. And we were in a restaurant where I remember this with a bit of profundity, or with a bit of a profound kind of recollection. Someone offered him tea in his cup, and he tapped the top and he said no. And the guy then sat back in his seat. So I was at a restaurant sitting quite close to Sifu. There were other students there. But then he nudged and looked in my direction, and he pointed to the teapot. And I thought, okay, this is odd. This guy has just offered tea right now in front of me, but Sifu wants me to pour him his cup. You do it. Yeah. So I poured it and he drank it, and he looked over to me and he said, tradition. Oh. And for me, once again, when you're reflecting on these types of lessons, and things have happened subsequent to him. So he left us in 2004. But even now, as the days go on, I start to realize that there may have been an underlying significance to that. So if you're involved in Chinese martial arts and training it in a more traditional way, you realize that was his informal way of accepting me as a student.
Yeah. And giving you your precedent.
Absolutely. And it's like, okay, boy, you've done enough. Yeah.
Boy, thanks. I've got my guy here for that.
Yeah. Boy, you've done enough. Okay, we'll start teaching you some stuff. Yeah. And then there's another thing that I want to shed a light on. That there are other people that trained with Sifu, other people that spent time with him. So he wasn't averse to training other people. But there's a certain degree of mystery surrounding this form that he refused to show the steel wire Mantis instructor, Sifu Tony Leung, back in 94 and 95. And I had pestered Sifu about this for about 6 or 7 years, saying, Biu-Ji form, can you talk about it or tell me about it or show me something of it? And he said no, but it was in the first form and the second form. So I'm like, okay, so in the basic forms in our lineage of Wing Chun, they have already contained, or they already contain what the third form is. So for him, in his conversations with me, no doubt other students, it was, there is no third form. There is no special form. There is no BUG. And then by about I'm going to say the year 9 or 10, one day I was there and he said, okay, you've learned everything else. Now I'll show you. And for me, it was just like, oh my God, this amazing new gateway or new door opened up to me. And I realized through the Bai Si ceremony, through the time that I'd spent with him, through all of his anger, disappointment at me for being so terrible a student, for progressing over these years of training with him, he had at some point decided that I was worthy enough, right? Which sounds kind of silly as I say it now, but worthy enough for him to show this last mysterious, elusive form. Yeah. So.
No, it's quite
Great story. Great story.
But with one caveat, and that is, this is for inside. This is for inside the sanctum or inside the door. And he actually pointed to the gate that connected the garden to the outside world. And he said, it's not for outside. And I think you'll both understand or comprehend the significance of that. And that is
indoor student. It's, that's the classic thing. And that's from where we were talking about his background, his whole way of thinking about what he was teaching. That's why I held it to the end. That's one of the inner. It might not even be an inner secret. There may be information in there, but it may be to do with actually improving the fighting. But that's kept till last. There's that bit that's kept till last. You know?
And whilst I'm not a traditionalist, I use these types of vehicles or these devices as tools to inspire the next generation. I have 2 boys. And they're both heavily involved in martial arts. One is 10 and one is 13. And they're intrigued by Wing Chun, which I've always refused to show them. I've refused to teach them. But even they understand that there's this form that my dad will practice and do every week, but he'll ensure that we're not here. And if we are about, we have to go into our bedroom or we have to hide away somewhere else in the house. Not because
reverse psychology.
Yeah, that's all it is. It's about inspiring this almost myth of traditional Chinese arts. Is trying to keep that last flame or that last ember flaming and saying, hey, if you happen to be part of the next generation, understand that these myths, these symbols and the symbolism and these archetypes, they all serve a purpose. And it's important.
I believe so. And you're making them want it.
Exactly, yeah.
That's rather than foist it on them and have the experience you had as a kid.
Yeah, and the Western approach is absolutely converse to this. You go, you pay your dues, you expect stuff to come to you. That's not the way.
Buying it a bit at a time, but a lot of people don't understand with the old traditional Sifus and stuff. It's not. This is not a money transaction that you're getting. No. It's family and tradition and everything else. They're like you say, they're inviting you into their family if you're accepted.
Exactly. And we're not talking about, so if people identify with commercial schools, which is fantastic, if your way and your route and your path in life is to attend a commercial school, I'm happy for you, right? It's just that there are a few people out there who understand that commercial type enterprise doesn't exist within traditional village methods. We're talking about hundreds of sub-styles of Chinese martial arts. By and large have been lost. Yeah. But those gatekeepers, those ones that preserve the knowledge, did so for a reason. Yeah. And for them, it was about, you have a master, you have someone who knows the knowledge, and you have someone who craves the knowledge, a disciple. Yeah. You have to go through a number of gateways to get to that point, right?
There's nothing wrong with the commercial side, from my point of view, because it suits some people. That's what they want. They don't want all the trappings and all the kind of history and culture. So, and they want something, a quick method of learning what they want to learn. And so there's loads of places that can go and choose whatever that is. And so that's great for them. And there is there is obviously a place for that, you know. More of a place for that In fact, some of the traditional stuff maybe.
And then when I put that through our Western prism or our Western lens or our Western reality tunnel, to quote Robert Anton Wilson, when people approach me about Wing Chun, unless I see that they do it with an open, objective mind, willing to learn, I have one absolute mantra, and that is, what I do probably isn't for you. Because I knew from my own experiences learning from this old man that he tried his damnedest to ensure that I wouldn't come back after each session. It's like,
wax that car, paint that fence.
Well, I mean, I know Nish was joking about watching The Karate Kid yesterday.
Brilliant.
You know, in any type of modern myth, you're going to find some seeds of truth, and that was the seed of truth.
Yeah.
But we, once again, without exotification, I continue to apply that, but in a Western way. Do what you do over there. I'll continue doing what I do behind closed doors with a couple of training partners. And I'm happy because that's the way that I've always trained.
Yeah. We've got a comment from Sifu Spencer. We did a talk with him maybe a couple of months ago. Junmo Wing Chun. That Canton restaurant was Li Xing's. Leung Sifu knew him and my Sifu. Do you keep in touch with other members of your family?
Do I keep in touch? There are a couple of older students of Sifu's that keep in touch with me. And if I'm in the UK, I'll go back and just try to share something that might help them on their own path. There are a couple of people that still float around London that are training Sifu's original Wing Chun. So I try and point them in the right direction. But in terms of martial arts families, if there's ever an example of dysfunctional families, you're never going to find a clearer example than martial arts circles, because what tends to happen is it's built on a premise of rivalry. It's built on a premise of combat, and that is one-upmanship. Am I better than you? Am I better than the next guy? So when Sifu died, the fallout was one where people claimed themselves to be inheritors, and they started continuing classes and this and that. And then I got emails about people wanting to know my input on whether they should teach. And I was as honest as possible. And that is, listen, you spent 4 years with him and you got up to the second form. What do you think Sifu would have wanted? Would he ask you to continue his teaching with, just a small amount of his knowledge, right? And it's not about trying to be ego-centered on my part. It's just about saying, well, what would Sifu have wanted? Would he have wanted that? And I let people answer the questions for themselves. So I don't stay in touch with anyone particularly. I tried to maintain relationships, but you always get this kind of passive aggressive kind of, we got this, what did you get? A bit of a question mark. And people have tried to call me out on the knowledge that I obtained. Every so often I might entertain it, and I remind people about some of the stuff I learned. And I learned Sionin Tao Chum Kyu Bilji, Mukyan Jong, Moi Fa Wu Dip Do. So the plum blossom butterfly swords, Mang Lung Go Gong, only the fiercest dragon crosses the river, dragon pole form.
Wow.
But in addition to that, I learned Tai Chi short form and Tai Chi long form. I also learned Hop Ga. I also learned Siu Tei Sin, the small steel wire. I also learned Dai Tei Sin, the large steel wire. The stuff that isn't Wing Chun related fell to the wayside for me personally. So whilst I learned quite a lot of stuff from Sifu, the way that I put it is I've forgotten more Kung Fu than most Kung Fu people learn. So I've forgotten most of that in order to focus on the stuff that most compels me forward in life, and that is the Wing Chun.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't stay in touch with anyone, Spencer.
So Leung Sifu passed away in 2004.
December the 7th of 2004. I just happened to have flown back from Vancouver, Canada, the night before he passed away, and I managed to spend, the last few hours with him, bedside in, I think it was Northern Middlesex Hospital. I don't think that's far away from you guys, Nish.
No. Oh, yeah.
And it was it was heartbreaking and tragic. I spoke to him, we held hands, I shed a few tears, and, you know, I just said, Sifu, I'll be back in the morning. He was dying of cancer at the time. And I just said, I'll be here in the morning. And I made arrangements to stay at a friend's house because I just arrived. I just went straight from Heathrow Airport to the hospital.
Yeah.
And I returned back to the hospital in the morning only to find that his bed had been packed up and it was empty. And that's when it sort of all the emotions and the feelings. And when you have the most important relationship of your life with a mentor, you know, it's hard to kind of resurface from that darkness. So I had a real difficult time with that for a few weeks after he passed away. You know, I remember a couple of things happened that were significant. I spoke to the nurse. She refused to give me information about him because I obviously wasn't a family member.
Yeah.
Once again, she was looking through her Western lens.
Yeah.
So I just told her I was a long-term student, and she said, I'm sorry he passed away. And, you know, the tears started streaming, and I remember in a bit of a haze, jumping on a bus and going to the old house where he used to train me. And I knocked on the door, and his daughter was there, and she welcomed me in. We had a cup of tea. We then traveled to his flat, which wasn't too far away. I said, you know, I bowed and said prayers in front of a picture of him. His daughter was kind enough to give me some personal belongings. I mean, I still wear Sifu's beads on my wrist, and I have done every day since.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I mean, there's never been any real closure to it, but there's been an amazing amount of acceptance of him passing away. But it left a bit of a gaping void, right? I defined myself with that time I spent with him, right?
Yeah.
Defined me. So to lose that was...
I kind of imagine, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's great. Thank you for sharing all of that and all that personal part of your life as well. So moving on, Jesse Glover. So how did that kind of come about? How did you even know about Jesse Glover? Was that just through, okay, you was a student of Bruce Lee and...
So at an early age, Bruce had left a bit of an imprint with me, which obviously took me to a particular path. And I managed to meet this old Chinese mystic who took me through these gateways or these portals of examining life through the lens of Chinese martial arts. I moved to Canada in 2004, January of 2004. And it was always in my plan to have Sifu come over to Vancouver and spend time with me. In fact, I was preparing a house for that very reason. It was a case of me setting up stuff to get him over here. When I was told that he was sick, I traveled back. And then after he died, I found myself back in Canada, just thinking about that and obsessing about it and feeling a deep sense of loss. I had met Jesse in March of 2004. I'd been aware of Jesse from maybe the age of 12 or 13 when I continued to buy martial arts magazines, and I was familiar with a lot of people that had associated themselves with Bruce, the more mainstream instructors of Jeet Kune Do. Jesse was always a bit enigmatic. So he was mentioned in a few magazines, but there wasn't any real semblance of information about him. Before I moved over to Vancouver, I remember reading an article about someone who had gone, I think it was from Inner Santos Club in LA, to visit Jesse in Seattle. And that was revelatory. So I looked at this article and they talked about how Jesse was as a human being, but more importantly, how he structured his training classes. And I remember reading it thinking, that can't be real. How can you turn up at this place and do these original Bruce Lee type exercises and do thousands of punches and all of this stuff? I couldn't quite comprehend it. I was sitting in my house in Vancouver just after my Sifu had died, and I emailed Jesse because we'd swapped details when I'd met him several months prior, and I said, Jesse, remember I talked to you about my Sifu and what I had learned in England. He just passed away and I'm a bit sort of broken up about it. I don't know what my path is. And Jesse wrote back and he said, come down to Seattle meet me on the corner of, I can't remember the name of the road, at such and such a time. I think it was like 11:45 a.m. And I thought, what? So now I've just lost my mentor. I've been in touch with Jesse, and maybe I was reaching out to him for a bit of life advice more than anything else, because, you know, I'd met him and he was such a great guy. But his attitude was just come down to Seattle, which is about a 2.5-hour drive from my place. I drove down on that Saturday, standing on this street corner just off Chinatown in Seattle, waiting for Jesse to turn up, or someone representing Jesse to turn up. And then you saw this black guy kind of with a beard, this woolly hat on, this big jacket. He was about 210 pounds, walking really slowly side to side with his hands in his pocket, and walk up to me. And the first words were, "Hey, follow me." Like, really? Like, am I going through this experience again, right? Especially stuff at the Mantis Club. And I followed Jesse down. He walked down the street. There was a grate with a doorbell on it. And he said, "Next time you come, press this bell." And, okay, we're going to go through the gate. And then he turned, shifted, and walked away from the gate about 15 yards up in the other direction, unlocked the door, and it was to this place called Atlas Apartments. So I just continued to follow almost like a sheep.
Yeah.
Missy then walked down into this kind of cement bunker under this apartment complex, down a long dark hallway. So you can see how this stuff kind of repeats itself. Past these pallets of books, and I can only describe it as books kind of that were stacked horizontally, thousands of them. So we're walking past these. To the left, through a door, he opens the door, and then you have a long concrete hallway with, I think there was one kind of fraying heavy bag on the wall and a sink to one corner, and then this kind of wooden closet on one side. And then when you looked around the room, which was sparse at best to describe it, you saw these punching mitts on the floor, these punching pads. And that, in January 2005, would lead me to the second phase of my training, which is moving from being a traditional Chinese martial artist to becoming someone trained in Jesse's non-classical Kung Fu, the original Seattle stuff.
Wow.
That him and Bruce developed from 1959 to 1962, working out, 2-3 times a day.
Yeah.
So that's how I met Jesse, or kind of reignited a relationship.
Great story, yeah.
Yeah. And so what happened there? Did you train?
I can tell you vividly what happened.
Yeah.
So no one else was there at this time, so we were about 5 or 10 minutes early, and Jesse said, "Do you stick?" As in, do you do sticking hands? Chisao, right? So for the traditional Wing Chun guys, Chisao, but he called it sticking hands. He said, "Do you stick?" And I said, "Yeah, Jesse." And I started rolling with him, starting to engage in the process of rolling. So I just started touching hands with him, and he thumped me in my chest. So I was like, wait a minute, I'm just getting my bearing with this. And then we started rotating again, and he hit me again, deep and hard into my chest.
Yeah.
And I was being pushed back at this particular point. And I'm like, I don't know what to do here. I'm completely out of my element. There's no cooperative rolling or rotation here. He's just connecting and hitting.
Yeah.
And that was to be my introduction into the way that he trained and his training methods. We waited, he smacked me around for a bit, and then eventually other students started coming in, and then we started the proper training. And it was eye-opening at worst. And at best, it was being around a feral bunch of, if I can describe them like this without causing too much offense, misfits from Seattle, who were all in great shape. They were muscular, the guys there in tank tops. There were women there putting on gloves and, wrapping their hands up. And the training sessions, in a nutshell, were extreme. And then it was through those extreme training sessions that I realized this is the reason why Jesse is so good. This is also the reason, because of the ambiance of the place, why Jesse isn't as well known in Bruce Lee circles as other students who are a bit more sort of mainstream and a bit more commercial. He had an insular closed off group, and he pushed them to the very extremes of movement for a psychological purpose. And that is, he wanted to test people's individual limits on what they thought they can do and separate them away from what he believed they were actually capable of. Yeah. And you had two options. You can either stick around, or more likely you leave and you forget about it and you don't come back and you don't talk about it and you don't write about it in magazines, because it puts you in such a position of inferiority that you don't even want to face up to those demons that have arisen when you've been pushed to those points of where you started to crumble and the shoulders became sore and you walk around with red welts on your chest. That's what the training was like. It was extreme. It was harsh. It was hostile. But did it make and produce good martial artists and good functional movers? In my experience, I've never met as solid a group of fighters in the combative street sense than the ones I met at Jesse's Seattle club.
Wow. Yeah.
So the sparring, was it just stand up, or did he kind of mix up? Was it the MMA type stuff? Was it dealing with all scenarios?
No. That's a really good question, Alex. Jesse met Bruce in 1959. Bruce had just arrived in the States from Hong Kong, and he'd spent, maybe, I don't know, maybe someone else can clarify, but I believe it's about 4 years with Ip Man, and then training a bit of time with Wong Song Leung. And by that point, Bruce had learned the first form, Sunim Tao Chum Kyu, the Ip Man Wing Chun version of it, and he'd learned a third of the dummy. Bruce was gifted with a couple of genetic tools, and that is, he had an abundance of fast twitch fiber. He found himself in Seattle with a desire, as I understand it, to teach cha-cha dancing more than anything else, because he believed commercially that was more feasible than anything else. He just happened to perform at a demonstration at the Seattle Sea Fair.
Yep.
Doing some Chinese martial arts on stage, and Jesse had spent his entire life looking for traditional martial arts. And by that point, I think he was either on his way to a black belt in judo, training with the Seattle Judo Club, or he was at brown belt level. Jesse was already a functional martial artist. He had boxed in the US Air Force, and he was training judo and competing in judo. I think he went 14 times without being beaten on the Northern Pacific Rim in judo competition. So he was a very high level judo player. And then he learned from Bruce Wing Chun, or at least a modified version of Wing Chun. And then Jesse and Bruce trained that system together. They absorbed some other stuff, including this kind of Western boxing aesthetic or ideas from Western boxing. And Jesse ran with those ideas, and he continued to train. And, he continued to teach, continued to train up until the point where I met him in 2004, right? So he was with Bruce 59 to about 62.
Right.
What was Jesse's approach, and what teaching did he impart on you?
Jesse's approach was very much kind of Wing Chun oriented in terms of the movements. There was no forms work. And there's a reason why Jesse, I think, referred to his process as non-classical Kung Fu, because he wanted to disassociate himself from classical Chinese traditional martial arts. So he had his own Western way of interpreting it. So I went from this incredibly Chinese traditional approach to this Western idea, or looking through the Western lens at traditional Chinese martial arts. So he modified it. There was no forms work. Most of his training was based around punches, different types of punches, low-level kicks, connected body-to-body attack patterns based around sticking hands. So his sparring was based around this game that he played. So he described it more as a training tool, device, or a game, which is the sticking hands part of it. And then out of sticking hands, you had basically people putting on headgear and trying to target one another, right, with ferocity.
Yeah.
And it was those kind of psychological undercurrents that made Jesse special in what he did.
It's wanting to make sure that what you're training works under pressure.
Yeah. So his ethos was he wanted to build a physical fighting structure for each person. How do I take an average person and turn them into a functional mover first and foremost? And then how do I provide a psychological structure for them to ascertain and differentiate when to switch into that mode and when to stay out of that mode in terms of self-preservation, right? One is, what are your psychological limits and how far can we push them? And the second part is, do you have the tools to understand how violence occurs and how to give it a wide berth and stay away from it as much as possible, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, yeah, that's the first step, isn't it?
Any questions on the chat, Al?
I think there was one. Yeah, look. Going back to the red boat training. Understand Selim Tao having an internal composition, an internal element, component, as it were.
Yeah.
Or is it just infused throughout the system? Is there a focus on the internal side of the system throughout the system, or is it contained?
Yeah.
Within Selim Tao?
The internal components shift slightly when you get deeper into the hand forms. So by this stage of the third form, you're looking at spiraling type motions that you do through the limbs, so through the legs and the arms. The first form, the Selim Tao, has an internal component that permeates throughout the form, and you'll also see it through the other forms. So for instance, the swords is about expressing force through the blade, projecting force or creating power through the blade. And you do that in terms of a body type of thing with correct body dynamics, but also with the correct will and intent that you project through the blade. And the same can be said of the pole, but the pole has a slightly different dynamic in terms of it being strength-based rather than the flow-based movement of the swords. Now, going back to Selim Tao, anyone familiar with the signatures of other Wing Chun lineages will find that they repeat a sequence. I think it's around the third or fourth section of Selim Tao where you do a repeated hand section, the Sambai Fat section, the 3 prayers to Buddha, as it's referred to.
Yeah.
During that section, so if the form on average takes about 4 minutes to complete, the Sambai Fat section in Red Boat Wing Chun, so one particular section in the first form should take 20 minutes on average to practice just that section.
Wow.
I've done it to the point where I've spent an hour doing just that section. And I'm not suggesting that other people do it, but if you spend a lot of time doing incredibly slow practice, which isn't discernible as movement to the uninitiated, a person watching you won't see any active movement because you're moving so slow. The idea is you're building an internal component within the structure.
So, yeah.
The Sambai Fat section, if there's any section that has to be emphasized in Wing Chun practice, generally it's that section. So, and this applies across the board. If you do Wing Chun, then the Sambai Fat should hold a special place of reverence over and above almost everything else you do in Wing Chun.
That's interesting. So you're trying to do just the 3 sections of movement but over a prolonged time.
Yeah.
Not constantly repeating.
No.
Right.
Yes. So you're doing that particularly slow. So what does that do? It will be a different experience depending on who you are. Yeah. The first thing that it will do is the body chatter starts to kick in, this negative self-talk, which is, this hurts. This is excruciating. I don't understand it. It's pointless. That's the monkey brain trying to put you off this internal component, which is where you switch off the body dynamic and defocus the idea of stress and suffering that the body is facing to move beyond that. And, it's the 3 prayers to Buddha section. There's a Buddhist undercurrent to this. Buddhism is what? Chan Buddhism specifically is what? It's telling you that life is suffering and you're suffering within that section of the form. But how do you move beyond that? And then for me, the way that I might suggest people do it, I have a couple of training partners, is think about your awareness, think about your yi or your intent and your will. Think about how you're expanding that awareness beyond body. So without, once again, being too esoteric about it, I try to present a meditative, contemplative aspect to doing the form so that they can unlock their own internal mystery of what it is to overcome the human condition. I know that sounds philosophical.
No, it sounds great. I do understand. Is there no idea with the will, with the intent, with the yi to circulate energy around the body, or is it just focusing on that movement?
So there were difficulties with language that I started to overcome after a few years with Sifu, but he never talked about this elusive, mysterious chi. So other students are in a position where they'll understand, other students of Sifu, and that is chi wasn't a major preoccupation for Sifu to focus on. There's an internal component based around Hakka systems generally. And for him, he didn't talk about kind of moving up the spine or sort of this kind of celestial orbit around the body. We didn't talk about that stuff. For him, that asked explicitly about chi, he said, no, do the form, do that section, but do it slow. And then you'll unlock what internal energetics are.
Interesting.
I believe that. I think it just happens naturally.
Yeah, people aren't willing to pay that much attention to the way they practice, and they're not generally willing to put in the amount of work that it takes to develop something. And it's not a case of you do it and then something appears. No, this is for people that are in it for the long haul. You've got to sit with it. You've got to suffer. You've got to do it year after year and then see where it takes you.
Yeah.
And people get taken to different places depending on what their will, what their intent wants, desires, and what actually actualizes in their lives and around them. Traditional martial arts aren't about just combat. It's about, hey, where has your life led you? Where are you now?
We've got a question from Mark Roberts. Hi, Suki, wise words. You say the key is for the art to become internal, instinctive. Do you have any method to help the student achieve this, or is it just deliberate practice and time?
I think the foundation is that, Mark. I think deliberate practice and time when it comes to any endeavor, any type of skill building activity. And the reason why I say that is because you do the traditional martial arts, but Western people that have written about it, psychologists like Anders Ericsson, authors like I mentioned before, like Robert Greene, all point to this mysterious, elusive quality that arises when you have mastered something. And what does it mean to master something? It means deliberate focus. It means spend your arbitrary 10,000 hours doing it, and then it will take on a quality which moves beyond body. So what does that mean from a physical perspective? Then from a physical perspective, it may mean that something is so entrenched in your central nervous system that it becomes so natural that it's just a byproduct of how you are as a human being. But to the uninitiated, people that are on the other end of the spectrum who don't train to that extent, it might take on a magical type quality when they observe you doing it. And I'm not just talking about Chinese martial arts. I'm talking about John Coltrane's jazz music. I'm talking about Jimi Hendrix strumming away at it, right? They've done something, they've learned it, they've had good mentors, they put in the time, they've internalized it, they've deliberately practiced, they've fumbled, they've made mistakes, and then they've individualized it so it becomes no different from them. There's no separation. The art is them. It's not you, the art is them, and it's expressed through this device, which is the human body, right?
It's like the sum of the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts.
Just out of it.
You train all these bits, you train in your arm, you're training your leg, but when it comes together, it creates this other element, as you were, that is undefinable.
Absolutely. Now I want to use that as a segue to talk about Jesse. So Jesse took Wing Chun, but he took the Pareto principle of it. So he said Wing Chun, as it's presented in its current form, 80% of it is superfluous movement that isn't going to lend itself to fighting, generally speaking, right? So the Pareto principle, which is, I believe it's an economic principle, which means 20% of what you do gives rise to 80% of your results. So another friend of mine, Robert Chu, talked about this from a slightly different perspective, which is, Suki, you do the forms, you do the practice, but how about this as an idea? Dissolve the forms. Find those things that have the most meaning and significance to you and focus on those. Jesse took that to an extreme, which is, what are those hand motions and leg motions that most contribute and lend themselves to combat? And we practice those, but we don't just practice them several times. We're talking about thousands, if not tens of thousands of times during a 2 or a 3 hour class in Seattle. And that's what people don't understand. For all the subsequent students who trained Bruce Lee's art or Bruce Lee related arts generally, don't know how to do something, but they didn't take it to the extreme limits of the human body that Jesse encouraged his group to do. And as a result of that, like I said, his group of feral fighters were some of the best functional movers that I've ever come across. And you'll see that if you manage to watch footage of some of Jesse's proper students, and we have to make a differentiation there. There are some people that associate themselves with the name, but they haven't put in the hard work. When you actually look at those guys that are most closely associated with non-classical Kung Fu, man, they look good.
Nice.
Oh, yeah.
So we're coming up to that 2 hour mark. And this has been an excellent talk. Thank you. Really great information, great history. Learned a lot about your Sifu and yourself.
And yourself, yeah.
We've just had the time because I really wanted to go into your thoughts on other things, but that's another hour or two of talking. So we don't have any more any questions on the group. So from my side, again, thank you for making the time to talk to us and share your experience, share some stories about your Sifu, and give us some more learnings about Upper Company and Red Belt Wing Chun. It's been a pleasure, and
I've really enjoyed it. It's been very pleasurable speaking to you. If you're ever in the UK, please, just hook us up, or get in touch with us.
100%, yeah. If you're gonna be in London, we'll definitely link. And for those that are on the group, again, thank you for the questions. Thank you for joining. Once this is all, once we're finished, I'll post the link and you can see some of Suki's stuff. And so thanks everyone. Suki, again, thanks for joining us.
Cheers everyone. Thank you.
Alex, Nisha, appreciate it. You guys take care. Stay safe.
We are